Welcome to the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Rosensweet, mom of 3 young people, peaceful parenting coach, and your cheerleader and guide on all things parenting. Each week, we'll cover the tools, strategies, and support you need to end the yelling and power struggles and encourage your kids to listen and cooperate so that you can enjoy your family time. I'm happy to say we have a great relationship with our 3 kids. The teen years have been easy and joyful, not because we're special unicorns, but because my kids were raised with peaceful parenting. I've also helped so many parents just like you stop struggling and enjoy their kids again. I'm excited to be here with you today and bring you the insight and information you need to make your parenting journey a little more peaceful. Let's dive into this week's conversation. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. Today's episode is a guest expert interview with Dr. Anna Neff, who is an autistic clinical psychologist. And we had a really fantastic conversation. I'm recording this intro after I spoke with her. We had a really fantastic conversation about parenting neurodivergent children, parenting well neurodivergent yourself. And also we talked about sensory dread versus anxiety and how to tell the difference between the two when your kid does not want to go somewhere, do something like school or swimming lessons or a birthday party. It was a super interesting conversation. And before you click this off thinking this doesn't apply to me because I am not neurodivergent and my child is not neurodivergent, I would encourage you to have a listen because I think that you may not identify as ND yourself or have an ND child, you probably have people in your life that you know or care about who are. And I think this episode is a really great insight into what it's like to be neurodivergent in the world. And also, as Dr. Neff says in the podcast, she didn't realize she was neurodivergent or her children were neurodivergent until much later in life. So it could be if you are having some challenges, some of this might maybe tweak something in you and you might start to explore that idea and see if any of this sounds familiar. Have a listen. And even if you don't think this applies to you, the world would be a better place if we all understood each other better and had more empathy and compassion for each other. Let's just dive in and you can hear my conversation with Dr. Anna Neff. Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. Today I am so excited to have Dr. Anna Neff join me. And she has her own podcast, which you might want to check out, called, fairly certain I'm getting this right, Neurodivergent Insights. Is that correct?
It's actually, the podcast is Divergent Conversations, which I co-host, but my website and platform is Neurodivergent Insights. I know,
great. So we got both of them out there now. And I'm so excited. We're going to be talking about parenting neurodivergent kids. We're going to be talking about parenting while neurodivergent. And we're going to be talking about Dr. Anna's new book that's just come out, I think tomorrow, but by the time you hear this podcast, it will be out, and it's about self-care for autistic people. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's so exciting. Can you give us a little intro of who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so I am a clinical psychologist. I'm neurodivergent in that I'm autistic, ADHD, and mild dyslexia. But I didn't discover this about myself until I was 37, till after one of my children was identified, which is like such a common story at this point for us neurodivergent adults. And I was just wrapping up my doctorate in clinical psychology. And so that was my big aha moment of like, oh, there's a lot the world needs to learn about neurodivergence. So then I kind of did a big career shift and I started Neurodivergent Insights, where I create education both about non-stereotypical neurodivergence, but also wellness resources for neurodivergent people. I use a lot of visuals because I think in images, and the neurodivergent brain tends to be very visual. So I'm kind of known for my infographics and visualization of these concepts.
Yeah, I did a deep dive on your Instagram account, and I love all of the graphics that you put together. They're really great.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so maybe we could start with talking about parenting while neurodivergent, because I know a lot of the parents who listen to my podcast have had a very similar experience to you, finding out that they're neurodivergent, whether they're autistic or ADHD or both, or another form of neurodivergence. They find out when their kids are getting assessed and diagnosed. And I think that there are definitely special challenges. Like parenting in general is hard, just to be honest. But I think there's some special challenges when you're neurodivergent in terms of parenting. From your own personal experience, if you don't mind sharing, and from your practice, maybe, do you mind just talking a little bit about what you see as some of those challenges that come as a neurodivergent parent?
Absolutely. I mean, how long do you have? I feel like I could talk about this a long time. And first of all, I just really appreciate the question. I think a lot of times, for good reasons, but a lot of the time the focus is on parenting neurodivergent children, and this added element of parenting while neurodivergent, parenting neurodivergent children often gets missed. And yeah, this comes up all the time. I actually ran an autistic moms group a couple years ago, and it was, I mean, there's definitely themes that come up, and it's a lot. There's a lot of challenges embedded in the experience that create kind of an additive level of stress. I think the the biggest one being sensory.
Mhm.
Children are high sensory creatures. Neurodivergent children can be especially high sensory creatures. They can be loud. They often don't sleep well. Feeding is often a challenge. And right now, I'm thinking back to my early years with my children. And we didn't have any of this lens of neurodivergence. And we had all those issues. We had sleeping issues. We had toileting issues. We had feeding issues. We had, one of my children, one of their stims was being hyperverbal. So constant, um, lots of vocal stimulus in the environment. And I didn't understand why I was exhausted and irritable all the time. Looking back, it's like, oh, I was chronically sensory overloaded, but I didn't have a lens for that. So I didn't know how to sensory self soothe. I didn't know how to take sensory breaks. I didn't know how to help my children with their sensory needs. So I think the sensory piece is a huge one. And until we cultivate a lens for that, a lot of us have a ton of shame. I think, especially those of us who are mothering, there's a lot of touch involved in that. There's a
Mhm.
lot of kind of cultural expectations around play dates. And when those things are hard for us, we can develop a lot of shame about our mothering. The other one that I think of is executive functioning challenges. Like, I know for me, I kept trying to create a routine for me and my kids. I was a stay-at-home mom for the first 4 or 5 years, but I could never stick with it. Or like, even, there's so much executive functioning that goes into parenting. And that was always really hard for me. And so that was another source of shame of like, I was looking at the peers and seeing them do things with ease that were so hard for me. And I just didn't understand why mothering was so hard, especially those early years. I'll stop there because I feel like I said a lot, but
Yeah,
there's
I'm
more.
going to start with the last thing you said and work backwards because I didn't realize that I have ADHD until last year when I have two diagnosed kids with ADHD, but until I was like interviewing people for this summit that I did, I kind of had a suspicion. And then, anyhow, one of my kids said to me once when I said dinner was ready, he looked at me and said, "It's only 6:30, Mom." Yeah, we usually eat around 8 or 8:30, but average people eat at dinner at 6 or 6:30. But, that was something that I found when you just mentioned the schedule. I found that really challenging too. But luckily, I had kids who were okay with staying up late and they would sleep late in the morning because I know some people's
Mhm.
kids, like, if they stay up too late, they still wake up really early. But we were able to work with the flow of my lack of being able to stick to a schedule. And I told myself that as long as kids knew that their needs were going to be met, that, everyone, I guess everyone sidebar, but everyone always tells you how important it is to have a routine and schedule for kids. And I think the underlying need is really like they know their needs will be met, even if they're maybe at 8:30 instead of 6. And anyhow, I can totally relate to that challenge. But going back to what you were talking about with the sensory challenges of being a neurodivergent parent, I think that is like super hard, that shame piece. So what I'm hearing in you, what you're saying is the first thing for parents who are experiencing that is that level of self-compassion and acceptance that there's nothing wrong with you and you're not a bad parent because you get really frustrated and maybe dysregulated with the constant noise or talking or touch or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That really addressing that shame, but we have to have insight into what's happening. And so many of us, I think that's the other part about parenting while neurodivergent that's hard. A lot of us don't have this lens in those early years when we have the highest sensory executive functioning demands on us. So the fact we don't have this lens, we don't then have kind of access to know what helps soothe me because we don't have this awareness. So the lack of identification, I think, is the other part that's really hard about neurodivergent parenting.
I think any parent who's finding that this is sounding, familiar and helpful, getting your book and going through the self-care piece, I thought it was really great. And just learning your sensory profile and learning different things that you can do for yourself. What did you, when you were a mother, you still are a mother, but when you were in those early mothering years and felt overwhelmed, did you find things that would help you? Or do you know, looking back, what might have helped you?
Mm-hmm. There were a couple things that helped me. My oldest was the hyperverbal, and keeping her alive, I would often joke, was a full-time job. Like their awareness of danger was not really a thing, but there was a lot of kind of risk taking around, like, let me climb up on this couch and see what it feels like to fall. And so there's a lot of hypervigilance that went into that parenting. And again, she was my first, so I didn't realize. And I have some anxiety, and my anxiety, I had postpartum anxiety. So like the combination of that was pretty brutal. So there were a few things I would do. One is getting a really good stroller and going on lots of long walks. And that provided some containment, and it would give me the walks were soothing for her, and it would give me a little bit of a sensory break, but it was still like a connecting experience. That was one. The other thing, I had two pregnancy losses between my kids, and so there was like a year where I was kind of in first trimester sickness. So I played a lot of shipwreck with my kid, where it's like, okay, we're going to play shipwreck. We're going to be on this bed, because I had a lot of fatigue. I had a lot of morning sickness. So finding ways, because fatigue was a really big issue for me during those years, both because of my own health stuff, but also having a child that didn't sleep very well. So finding ways to gamify being able to lay horizontally was huge. And that sounds simple, but that saved me during that year of multiple pregnancies. Those are a couple that come to mind. I'm sure there are others. If people have family or friends where they can actually get sensory breaks, I think that's really important. I think communicating, if you're in the privilege of having a two-family home, like being really communicative about both parents taking sensory breaks and being able to have kind of time away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I found that tricky as well. Like that, I think I really need time alone for like my own rejuvenation. And that is one of the things that is so hard to get when you have 3 little kids, or however many little kids you have, is just time alone. And that was one of the hardest things I found about those early years, is just always having people with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of it is also so I actually worked in an OBGYN clinic for a handful of years as a therapist. So I worked with a lot of women specifically through the pregnancy years and the early years. And that this was a theme, neurodivergent or not, this theme came up a lot around, like, you're never off the clock, especially often for mothers. And so I would assign that to them. Sometimes I'd assign them, okay, you need off the clock time. So I know it's hard for you to request this from your spouse, but tell them it's coming from me. I'm
Mm-hmm.
like assigning off the clock time. It's a prescription. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And that would often, because a lot of mothers will often have guilt of like, I shouldn't need this. I shouldn't need time away from my kids. So there's that secondary narrative of, what does it mean if I'm saying I need a break from my kids? Does it mean I love them less? Does it mean I'm less of a mother? There's also the cultural scripts that we've often internalized that are getting in our own way as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I love just what you were talking about before, the shipwreck game. There's actually an article that I've sent to so many parents, and it's something like 6 games. I didn't write it. Pinky McKay, I think in Australia, wrote it as like 6 games to play when you don't want to play anymore. And they're all games that involve lying down and your kids doing things while you're lying there on the floor or on the couch or on your bed. So we'll link to that in the show notes for anyone, because we'll have to add shipwreck to that list, because
Oh
I think
my
it's really
gosh.
valuable to have this list of things you can play. One of them is called Dead Fish, I think. I don't remember what it is, but
Oh, I love that so much. I could have used that article 10 years ago. That's amazing.
totally. I used to get the kids to do shows for me while I was sitting on the couch, like,
Mm-hmm.
show me this, do a little show, and that was always a good one too.
That is a good one. I like that, because also the child then they're feeling seen, because you're saying,
Mm-hmm.
I want to delight in you. I want to see something, like, so I really like that too. It's very connecting while also allowing your body rest.
Totally. Yeah. And you can have a cup of tea while you're
Yeah.
doing it too, or a
Yeah.
coffee or whatever. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit. Well, before I shift gears to away from parenting while neurodivergent, is there anything that you wish that I had asked you about that you want my listeners to know about?
I think one thing I'm already feeling, when you say something and then in the back of your head, you're like, you feel guilt about what you say, or there's
Okay.
always the critique, right? So I'm like, wow, did that make it sound, when I was talking about kids being high sensory, I was like, I wonder if that makes it sound like I don't like kids very much. And so
I didn't
one thing
get
I
that.
want to say, well, one thing that's been really powerful about connecting with other neurodivergent parents is this connection of like, we love our kids. And there's kind of this known, we love our kids, and it's really hard. And when you can find people that can hold that tension of, I adore my kids, I love my kids, and let's also be able to be honest about the fact it's hard without activating all that shame. I've found some of those conversations the most helpful, to find those people where you can hold the both end of that.
Yeah, I think that's really important in general. I think it can be really hard to talk about when it's hard because we're afraid that people will think that we don't love our kids or we wish we didn't have them or whatever. So it's good to really have that out in the open, I think. Let's shift a little bit to parenting neurodivergent kids. And what are some of the best ways that you help people or recommend to people to be a neurodivergent affirming parent? And what do you think parents of neurodivergent kids should know?
This probably won't be shocking based on everything I've said so far, but I think the very first thing is this idea. I call it like cultivating a sensory lens. The idea of, and I say lens because it really is like a way of seeing the world. And we don't live in a society that has a sensory lens. Like, we don't intuitively think through, when I say if a friend says to me, like, hey, do you want to go get coffee? We're typically not intuitively thinking through what are the sensory requirements or demands embedded in that request. And so it's just not a lens we have as a society. So naturally, most of us, unless we've intentionally developed one, don't have this toward our parenting. So for example, looking back at my own parenting, I cringe with regret of there's so many meltdowns, sensory meltdowns, that I assign to character or I assign to a tantrum. And it's because I didn't have that lens. And so I think the very first thing is cultivating a sensory lens of, so if a child's having a difficult moment, like, first thing should be, are there sensory irritants in the environment? And how can I reduce sensory demands right now? But that's often not, for many of us, that's not often our first default response to a difficult behavior. And even as children get older, I find also, because I work a lot with parents of adolescents as well, and they'll be like, well, my kid doesn't want to do this or that. And I'll say, well, have you thought about what that might be like for them, to go to a busy mall or to go to a restaurant? And so just thinking through the sensory experience of your child in the requests you're making, in the expectations you have, even thinking about if kids are doing in-person school, like, that's all their sensory, like,
Yeah.
spoons right there, is just going to school.
I think parents are already familiar with a little bit of that, and maybe this can help them stretch, is that we often are very easy to accept that kids are having a hard time because they're hungry or because they're tired. Like, those are two, I guess those are sensory, those can be seen as sensory things, and that, that can extend to other stressors in the environment. And do you know the work of Stuart Shanker? His book is called Self-Reg. Well, one of his books, but he says misbehavior is stressed behavior. And he
Oh, I
talks a lot
love
about,
that.
he talks
Yeah.
a lot about the sensory system too, and how, you have to be a stress detective. And I think that fits in really well with what you're saying, is like, what could be going on, we always say in peaceful parenting, what's driving the behavior, like what's underneath the surface that we don't see. So I think that's really great to really focus on and highlight.
I love that language of stress detective. Yeah, I say similar, like, be a sensory detective, but stress detector, I like that because it's more broad. And all of these things are our body, right? So it's like food, hunger, sensory, versus jumping to kind of will or character, kind of things that parenting of maybe 20 years ago might have
Yeah.
been the
It's
default.
shifting to that they're having a hard time not giving me a hard time, something that we always
Oh, I
say.
love that. I love
Yeah.
that. They're having a hard
Yeah.
time not giving me a hard time. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I really love that. I,
Anything else that you want to add about being, was looking at challenges through a sensory lens? What else do you think is important to know about parenting neurodivergent children?
Another question that comes up a lot is around talking about, if they've been diagnosed, talking about the diagnosis or the identification. And there's a lot of questions, historically, especially with autism, also ADHD, but not quite as much. With autism, there's a sense of like maybe wanting to protect the child from this label. And so I think even just how neurology is talked about in the home. I often talk about how important it is to create a shared language in the home. So, for example, in our home, like we'll talk about clashing sensory needs, or if a child asks me for something, but I'm in the middle of a task, I'll say, give me 2 minutes to task switch. And so we have all this language we've developed around task switching and sensory and executive functioning. And it's taken us years to develop that language, but we wouldn't have any of that if we weren't even talking about neurodivergence or neurotype. So I think there can be a lot of understandable fear about bringing up the topic, but I would say normalizing it, normalizing that there are brains that function differently, and having that be part of the conversation from pretty early on is one way of being affirming it. There's been some research around this that looked at kind of when a child learned this about themselves, and then kind of how much stigma they had around it, how much they were able to incorporate it as part of their identity. And what that study found was those that learned about it younger, that there was some positive kind of momentum around that, and that people that learned about it later had wished they would have learned about it when they were younger. And one thing I'd throw into that bucket, or did I cut you off?
No, it's okay.
Okay. One thing I'd throw into that bucket is parent curiosity about their own neurotype. Sometimes I'll get the question of like, well, is it selfish to start looking at my own neurodivergence? Isn't this supposed to be about my kid? But we know often when a child's neurodivergent, one of the parents is. And I actually think getting curious about that and learning about our own neurology can be a way of creating that language with our children and more insight into all of the dynamics in the home.
My daughter, she didn't get her ADHD assessment till she was 12. And it was such a positive, life-changing and life-affirming moment for her, like learning about ADHD and all the times that she'd gotten, quote, in trouble by teachers for not raising her hand and not trying hard enough and all the things. She finally was like, I'm not broken. This isn't, as you said, like a character problem. My brain is different. And to that point, I think it's so wonderful that there are so many books out now, kids' books about explaining neurodivergence. I think that's really great too, and helping kids understand their own brains and how their brains work differently.
Absolutely. This is a little bit divergent, but I actually think this is an important thing to have as a frame of reference for parents. I love the story of your daughter and the relief that she felt about the diagnosis. And I do think it is a different experience when the diagnosis comes as relief. And typically it's because the diagnosis is replacing character-based labels, because you're not neurodivergent and get to 12 without explaining your behavior one way. And usually 100%. It's through character. Mm-hmm. And so for folks who are, diagnosed, identified later in life, there's often a lot of relief. And frankly, in a lot of the advocacy spaces, that's a lot of us, people like me, where I was like, oh my gosh, a lifetime of relief. But when our children are 4 or 5 and given this diagnosis, that might not be their story of the diagnosis. And I think making room for it's not always a relief. For some kids, there is grief that comes with it. And they don't have that like, aha, oh, I get to replace that character with this. And so also creating space for there's going to be a lot of different experiences around the identification in a given family.
That's so important to mention, and for parents as well, because I know a lot of parents, if they aren't very informed about neurodivergence, and then they find out their kid gets a diagnosis, it can be that grief instead of relief for them, because they have an idea, hopefully misinformed idea of what it's like to be autistic or what it's like to have ADHD. And I thanks for holding space for that.
Yeah. Well, and I think that parental grief is an important part of the journey. And it's not something that we need to feel shame about. I think all of us, when a child is born, whether we're aware of it or not, have some idea of what we want that child's life to look like. And so for many, there might be, and it might be grief of like, now my child's going to experience more marginalization, right? The grief can look a lot of different ways. But I think it is important for parents to process that somewhere so that that's not getting kind of reenacted in the parent-child relationship. I think it can be hard though, because a lot of us maybe want to jump to, but I'm a neurodivergent affirming parent, so I don't have grief. But actually, I think part of being a neurodivergent affirming parent is like really working through our complex emotions around our neurodivergence, around our child's neurodivergence, and fears. There can be a lot of fear that can come up.
Yeah, totally.
It's complicated.
I'll just speak from my own perspective about being ADHD that are like really great and a gift, and I love those things about me. And then there are also, things that can make life harder. Being neurodivergent affirming, I don't think is like rose-colored glasses where you don't ever look at the hard stuff.
Exactly. It's holding space for the complexity. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to totally shift gears to something that I've heard you talk about. And Corey, who works with me, was like, you have to ask Dr. Megan Anna about this, because she like her mind got blown when she heard you talking about it on another podcast, which is sensory dread versus anxiety. People who listen to my podcast know we talk all the time about anxiety and how anxiety gets worse when you avoid the things that make you anxious. And, we want to really try not to to help our children avoid things when they're anxious. But what we've learned from you is that sensory dread is a totally different thing, but it can look like the same thing, like a child who doesn't want to go to school or doesn't want to go to the birthday party. Help us understand the difference between sensory dread and anxiety, and then how you would approach each one differently.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. First of all, I need to not take credit for this idea, because this comes from Dr. Jonathan Dalton, who is fantastic. He is kind of one of the leading experts around school avoidance, and he is a specialist in anxiety. I actually have a talk with him, and I can share that with you if
awesome. Yeah, we'll link to it if you share it with me. We'll link to it in the show notes.
So this idea comes from him, and I loved it when I heard him unpack it. So the idea of sensory dread would be like, I know something's going to happen, right? So I think what most adults can probably connect to is like going to the dentist. Of we know what the sensory experience around that might be, and we dread it. For a child, it might be, I know when I go to school, there's going to be lights, there's going to be kids, there's going to I know what's going to happen, and I dread it, and I don't want to go. And so it's not inaccurate because it's based on kind of what has happened in the past and what does happen. Anxiety is it's tricky, right? It's the mind is often asking the what if, like this might happen or that might happen. And so there's this cognitive element of it, of anticipating what might happen. And so that can also, both of these can lead to avoidance. And that, I think that's what's really important to understand. With sensory dread, if it's leading to avoidance, sorry, my throat I'm at the start of a cold. So my throat, We'll see if it holds up the rest of the interview. But so with sensory dread, we want to accommodate it. We want to figure out, okay, what are the sensory pieces? Are there things we can accommodate for? Is this even like a reasonable request for you to go to a birthday party on a weekend when you're recovering from school? So it's a totally different conversation, because we're thinking about accommodating the needs, and we're thinking about the sensory needs. With anxiety, so when we avoid things that scare us, it actually grows anxiety. So we want to take the opposite approach to anxiety. We want to reduce avoidance behavior. This is where anxiety in autistic people gets really tricky, because we're needing to it's like hitting the gas and the brake pedal at the same time. We want to accommodate sensory needs, but we also want to reduce avoidance. So for example, with one of my children, in-person school avoidance has been something that we have been navigating. So we will do a check-in of like, okay, is this anxiety, or is this like physical health stuff? Is this sensory? And we're helping them to have language around what is happening that they're not wanting to go to school. And we address those very differently, because again, with anxiety, we want to push through the avoidance, because that's actually what helps reduce the anxiety. I don't know. Did I get too much in the weeds? Or
No, that was super helpful. I'll just say an example of a kid who doesn't want to go to swimming lessons. And how would you sort of, if you were that kid's parent, how would you unpack whether that was anxiety about maybe separation anxiety because they have to go away from you versus like the cold water, the loud noises, the bright lights? How would you unpack that as a parent?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it would depend on age. And in some ways, like I wish I had this lens when I was younger, but at the same time, I feel lucky in the sense that my kids can articulate their inner experiences pretty well at this point. That's definitely going to be harder when they're younger. And if they're struggling to be able to articulate, like all they might have is like, it's bad.
Yeah, I hate it. I
But
hate swimming
yeah,
lessons.
I hate it. So if they can tolerate the questions, like, okay, like, can we tease out what feels bad about it? Like the water, the sound, like, and if I think so in the case of swimming lessons, what I would maybe try I would try going to the pool at a time that it's less busy, me and the child, and then being the detective, like you talked about earlier, of like seeing how that is for them. And again, you can ask kind of specific questions when you're in the experience. It's going to be a little bit easier. Like, and you can also observe, like, if it's the water, like, how's the water feel? So I would, like, I don't think any, especially neurodivergent kid, would probably do great in a swim class. And so I would break it down and start smaller and then figure out what the stressors are.
Yeah, I think you would probably have other clues too, right? You could kind of compare and look at the different aspects and figure out if it's
Yeah.
anxiety or if it's a sensory thing.
And I think the other thing that's important to keep in mind, most children won't know what it is. So even adults, like most autistic people will describe sensory overwhelm as anxiety until they have the language of sensory, because that's what it feels like in the body. It doesn't feel good. It feels kind of agitating. And so a child won't be like necessarily know like this is sensory overload. And so it really is on the parent to be that detective of how do they respond in different environments. Yeah.
Yeah, because anxiety or the sensory overwhelm would both set off that fight, flight, or freeze, which would feel very similar in the body and give you the similar thoughts of, I've got to get out of here. I don't want to go to this place. Yeah.
Yeah. And then also like reducing sensory. So if a child's starting to get anxious or have a hard time, like can you dim the lights? Is there background noise you can turn off? There's subtle ways you can reduce sensory input. And then again, see how the child responds to that. If they calm down, that was a sensory connection.
Yeah, or just wait for swimming lessons till they're older and they can tell you more about what
we ended up, I guess we did start with that. We ended up doing, and this takes privilege to be able to do this, but we did end up doing private lessons for both our children, which honestly, financially, I think it would have taken us so long to actually get those swimming markers in a group context that maybe it actually worked
probably
out
balanced
similarly.
out. Yeah,
probably balanced out. But that was so much better for so many reasons. And that's how we got those, because swimming safety, water safety is important for neurodivergent kids. And it's easy to just avoid it because it's hard. So I actually think that's a really great example, because figuring out, okay, how can we adapt this to make it work for our children?
Yeah, and I know there are some pools that are warmer than others and different times of day that you can go. And even if you just start out by, we're getting into like the weeds of swimming lessons, but just start out by going, I always say, just go to like family swims, maybe with your kids if they don't want to do lessons, and you can figure out as they get a little bit older what would be supportive around that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, let's shift a little bit to talking about your book, which I thought was really great. Even though I'm not autistic, I learned a lot. I have autistic people in my life, so I also got some insight into them as well. Where do you think that there's differences in the needs of self-care for autistic people versus allistic people? For people who don't know, that's just not autistic people, allistic.
I don't know that the needs itself are that different. Well, okay. The one need that is different, I feel like I'm just like repeating myself now, but sensory self-care, like that's often the foundation to self-care for us. And so I guess that is one area that the need is different. But what I was about to say is I don't know so much that the needs are different, but maybe the barriers to accessing self-care are slightly different. So one way I think about self-care or kind of conceptualize it in my own mind is that it's a way of being with ourselves in the sense that it starts with self-attunement, the ability to attune into this is what's happening for me right now. And from there, being able to make an informed decision about this is what I need. This is what I need in this moment. That ability to tune into our inner state, our inner world, is a lot harder for many of us. And that's for many reasons. Things like, so interoception differences, and interoception is that awareness of what's happening inside our body. That's often different for many of us. And so that can make it harder to know, like, if we're thirsty or what emotion we're having. Or I also think things like masking, or many neurodivergent people will kind of accommodate to social differences by becoming perpetual people pleasers. So all of these things make it quite a bit harder to tune into our own inner world. And so I think starting there with like, okay, let's identify the blocks to even knowing what's happening for you at any given moment. That often becomes really foundational for autistic self-care. And so it's not so much that maybe self-care looks drastically different, but that the barriers we have to accessing it can be a bit complex.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that. I think that's really good to keep in mind. And I think also one thing I got from your book was that for autistic people, there's so much internalized ableism, and that just even making people aware of that they may have taken on, I shouldn't have to do this, or this, I should be able to do this. That seemed like a really big part of your book too, is like, it's okay to need things, and it's okay to say what you need, and it's okay to, not maybe be able to cope with certain things that someone who's not autistic might be able to.
I like that. Yeah, it's not just about like cueing into our needs, but also the ability of taking our needs seriously.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that's hard for a lot of us. And that, exactly like you just said, it goes back to internalized ableism and all of these other things of like, I shouldn't need that. I shouldn't need this accommodation. I shouldn't need the extra time. I shouldn't need 9 hours of sleep. And so there's a lot of kind of ways of thinking and a lot of that ableism that we have to deconstruct before we're able to be with ourselves gently and in a way that, frankly, that where we are able to care for ourselves.
I will put a link to your book in the show notes, and I highly recommend it. So I'm going to ask you a question that I ask all my guests, which is, if you could go back in time to your younger parent self, what advice would you give yourself?
I love that question. Can I give her information instead
You can
of
give
advice?
her anything you want.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would have, so I often say this, and I actually ask people this a lot, of like, what age would you have wanted to know about your neurodivergence? And I actually think I learned about my autism at the right age, but I wish I'd known about my children's. I wish I knew they were neurodivergent. There are so many moments that I would have just done so differently if I had known. And so I wish I could have injected that, and my own. That would have actually been helpful. But yeah, I just wish I could have injected information about the fact that here I was, neurodivergent, parenting 2 neurodivergent children. That would have helped immensely.
Yeah. Well, I guess we have to just forgive ourselves for all of the not knowing and things that we would have done differently if we had known.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That is literally one of the entries in the book, is forgive yourself, because when you don't know, you don't know. Yeah. And we have to forgive ourselves for our past.
Yeah. That comes up a lot with coaching parents and peaceful parenting, and they start to understand the effects of, punishment and yelling and all of the things. And they feel so bad for having used conventional discipline for the first 5 years or whatever. And I say, you have to forgive yourself for not knowing what you know now before you knew it.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Yeah.
Where's the best place for people to go and find out more about you and what you do? Where do you want us to send people?
It kind of depends how people like to take in information. If you like a quick visual, then go to my Instagram. I also post them on Facebook and LinkedIn, but I'm most active on Instagram. If you are a reader and you like blog posts, I also have lots and lots of free articles up on my website, neurodivergentinsights.com, about things like interoception and lots of sensory stuff, also stuff like rejection sensitivity. And I have a newsletter. I have one dedicated to parents, which you can find links for on my website. And then I do run a community. If someone is neurodivergent in parenting, we do invite neurotypical parents, but I think the people that get the most out of the community are probably neurodivergent parents. It's a neurodivergent community, but a lot of us also happen to be parents.
Okay.
So I run that as well. And there's information on my website about that community as well.
All right, great. And remind me of I've been listening to your podcast, but of course I don't look at the title, so I can't remember what it's called. But remind me again of what it's called.
That's called Divergent Conversations. And I will just say I'm blanking on the words. We're both autistic ADHD therapists. It is explicit. That's the word.
Okay.
So if you don't want your kids hearing explicit words, don't listen to it when you're around your kids.
Forewarned, there is swearing. Okay.
Yes.
All right. That's good to know. Well, thank you so much, Megan Anna. It was really nice to meet you. And I think this is going to be a really helpful conversation for so many parents out there. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. I hope you found this conversation insightful and exactly what you needed in this moment. Be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Remember that I'm rooting for you. I see you out there showing up for your kids and doing the best you can. Sending hugs over the airwaves today. Hang in there. You've got this.